Like I kept favorite pieces. I mean, you'll see I have to wear one tomorrow, but I give it to everybody in my office. And everyone knows when shopping in my closet.
I call to order the June 2023 meeting of the Finance and Operations Committee of the University of Minnesota. Thank you to those who are joining us by live stream and those attending in our boardroom or by way of Zoom. Let me welcome our student representatives for today, Sarah Davis and Riley Tuft. Hi, from the Duluth campus. Okay, so our first item is to act on the President's recommended fiscal year 2024 annual capital improvement budget. President Gable and Senior Vice President Franz will walk us through it. President Gable, would you like to start us off?
Yes, thank you, Chair Hipsch and members of the committee. Good morning. So as part of Board of Regents policy, the administration is directed to develop a capital budget with, and this is the policy language, a 6-year time horizon updated annually. So what you have before you is this year's in that 6-year rolling timeline. The capital budget before you is for action, and it authorizes projects to begin design and construction during the upcoming fiscal year. And in sum, the fiscal year 2024 capital budget authorizes projects totaling over $345 million. The budget also reflects the outcome of the 2023 legislative session, where the legislature, we're very grateful to say, agreed to a $2.6 billion bonding package, which includes $136 million for the U, including funds for HEAPR and the chemistry undergraduate teaching laboratory facility on the Twin Cities campus. The remaining projects not funded by the state have been removed from the budget that's before you. So I want to thank Senior Vice President Myron Franz and his team for their work in bringing this capital budget to you for review today, and I will turn it over to him with your permission, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, President Gable. And before we turn to, Senior Vice President Franz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't take that personally.
No.
Thank you all, and thank you, President Gable, and to the team for putting this together. What we're showing here is the new proposed revised 2024 annual capital improvement budget of $345.5 million. I want to highlight quickly the changes that were made since we talked last May. As you recall, last month in May, we reviewed this proposal last month, and at that time we had a $636 million proposal, but because of some of the changes that President Gable referenced at the legislature, we've reduced that down. So our slide now reveals that we have $345 million. Instead of our request of $371 million in funding from the state, we received $136 million. And that breaks down into $43 million in our HEAPR funding for the higher education asset preservation and replacement, and also $92 million for our chemistry undergraduate teaching lab facilities on the Twin Cities campus. So one of the things I want to be clear, as President Gable also mentioned, we're very excited to move ahead with the chemistry teaching lab facility, and our teams are ready to move as soon as the board approves this budget item today. We submit this for action today, and we're preparing. I want you to know that we are preparing for the next state capital request. That begins next week for us. And just so you know, we never stop planning. That's kind of our middle name, and we're getting ready for next year. But one of the things I wanted to note in the information items, you will see a preliminary state capital request. That's here for your information only at this time. You will be presented formally with a review of this item in September, for action in October, for submission to the Minnesota Management Budget on October 15th. So we have to submit a preliminary budget on June 16th. So this is to let you know what we're submitting that can be changed and likely will be changed between now and September. But there's a lot of moving parts with the annual capital budget. But with that, Mr. Chair, I'm ready for any questions.
Thank you, Vice President Franz. Before we turn to discussion, is there a motion to recommend approval of the President's recommended fiscal year 2024 annual capital improvement budget?
So moved.
There's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, now we'll turn to discussion. Is there any discussion? We talked about this extensively last month, so there being no further discussion, you appear ready to vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, say no. Okay, the motion is approved. Okay, next, our second item is review of the president's recommended fiscal year 2024 annual operating budget. The board will act on the operating budget at a special meeting on June 26th. Until then, we'll be collecting feedback on the budget from the university community. The board launched an online feedback form to collect comments from the community. You can visit the board's website, regents.umn.edu, to submit your comments. The online comment period will close at 12 p.m. on June 20th. Input received during the comment period will be included in the June 26th meeting packet and become part of the official public record. The name and affiliation of the commenter will also be included. Additionally, we will be holding a public forum on the operating budget today, beginning at 1 p.m. Sign-up will take place at 12:30 p.m. in the West Committee Room. Now let me give a warm welcome to Senior Vice President Franz and Vice President Tonneson to introduce the operating budget. Senior Vice President Franz, take it away.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I warmly appreciate your comments. Thank you. And thank you, members of the committee. As we go into the budget discussion today, we want to make sure that we understand where we are in terms of the legislative process. As you know, the legislature enacted a budget, and the biennial budget proposal we have today will include those legislative changes from the legislature that we have worked into the budget. So we're presenting today the recommended annual budget for the first year of the biennium, fiscal 24, which starts on July 1, 2023, and ends on June 30, 2024. Just like the capital budget, next week we begin the process for developing the fiscal 25 annual operating budget for the second year of the biennium, and we are already contacting people to begin the consulting process because one of the challenges in preparing a budget is that we will bring this to the board this fall, but we want to give faculty and staff and students an opportunity to participate in that discussion, and that will be starting, I think, literally next week. The recommended fiscal 24 annual operating budget that we present today for your review incorporates the state appropriation plus all other funds and activities that make up the other 83% of our budget. As we will highlight in the presentation, the two most impactful decisions built into our recommendations are the general tuition rate increases of 3.5% for the Twin Cities and Rochester campuses and a 1% increase for our Crookston, Duluth, and Morris campuses. In addition, there is a compensation increase of 4% broken into two components, one for merit increases of about 3.75%, and another one for market adjustments at 0.25% where appropriate. These two decisions, combined with all the changes in state appropriations, create the building blocks for what is a very complex and detailed budget. Today, we're asking for review, and we will return on June 26, as Chair Hips mentioned, for action on the fiscal 24 annual operating budget. The operating budget includes decisions about tuition, compensation, but also the impact of those decisions, as well as the estimates and plans for other funds and items presented for you today. So with your permission, Chair Hips, I would ask Vice President and Budget Director Tonneson to walk us through the slides.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead. Vice President Tonneson.
Thank you, Chair Hipsch, and good morning, everyone. We recognize there's a lot of information on the budget in your docket materials. A lot of that is there because we feel it's important to document what is in the official budget of the university. But today, I'm not going to attempt to explain everything in that document. Believe me, I could talk for hours, but I am going to limit my scripted comments to about 30 minutes to try to summarize and explain what we feel is important for understanding the all funds budget that we're asking you to take action on later this month. So, starting with the revenues. The pie chart for FY24, incorporating the President's recommendations as well as estimates of ongoing activity, looks very similar to the distribution among the pieces we were seeing just before the pandemic. The total projected revenues of $4.5 billion are distributed across the restricted, auxiliary, and unrestricted categories as pictured here. And you can see that 38% of the budget will come from the O&M, state appropriation, and tuition combined. That's those dark green pieces. All revenues combined, excluding internal sales, are projected to be up approximately $165 million from this year. Most significantly, the budget includes an increase of $56 million in state appropriations, $30 million in sponsored grants, roughly $23 million in tuition, and another $29 million in auxiliary funds. The assumptions we've built into the projections for funds outside of the known state appropriation and projected tuition revenues, and that are evident in attachment 2 to the budget, the all funds fiscal page, include what you see here. ICR, which is our unrestricted reimbursement for overhead on our sponsored projects, is, as in most years, it is actually expected to fall off just a tiny bit from this year's updated projections, and that's even though we expect sponsored research to grow. Our units take a conservative route usually in planning for ICR because of all of the unknowns, and so the budgeted amount is actually usually less than we actually received. The budget is showing that we will be down about just 1.7 million, so essentially stable from this year. We're anticipating continued growth closer to historical trends for most other types of revenues, averaging 3.5%, with the exception of our auxiliary rates, which we anticipate to be up actually closer to 7%. And we will talk more about those plans in an upcoming slide when we talk about and in combination with our recommendations on tuition changes. Moving to the spending projections at this high level, expenditures of roughly $4.4 billion are estimated to be up 4% from the current year, an increase of roughly $170 million, again, excluding internal sales. They're displayed here by object of expenditure category. The distribution across these categories really does not change appreciably from year to year, but there are a few takeaway items embedded within these numbers and the changes compared to this year. First, as reflected again on attachment 2, you would see that projected spending on salaries is up 4.25%, which reflects the recommended salary plan that we'll discuss in an upcoming slide, and the general expectation of additional retention issues, promotions, net new hires, and other types of miscellaneous adjustments. Plus, the cost of fringe benefits is expected to grow 6% from this year due to increased healthcare benefit costs between FY21 and FY22. That's a lagged expense for us. Outside of salary and fringe categories, the expenditure side of the budget reflects growth levels of 3 to 4%, similar to most of the revenues. This rate of growth is under the rate of inflation for a couple of reasons. The impact of inflation does vary by unit and activity, and their response to extraordinary cost growth is often to buy less or buy differently, so the level of spending is held down automatically by their decisions to remain within budget, within their available resources. And second, the impact of reallocations is sprinkled throughout these categories, which also holds down the rate of growth in spending. And finally, the projection of sponsored grant activity on the expenditure side matches that of the revenues, up 30 million or 4%, due to the anticipated continued success in attaining more of those awards. Very quickly, when you look at the experienced annual changes in expenditure totals over time, that overall growth of roughly 4% fits right in with the general variability we generally see in these rates of change. Expenditures tend to be more volatile in a couple of categories, particularly in equipment and purchases of professional services or contracts. If a year with large one-time purchases follows one without them, the change can be a high rate of growth. Then the following year will show a low rate of growth comparatively if those one-time costs don't continue. And you can see that in FY16 and FY17 as an example. FY21 reflects the impact of the pandemic and our significantly reduced activities and spending in that year, which then meant even at normal levels of spending in FY22, the swing from that really low level meant an actual growth of 11.5%. The other piece of information on this slide speaks to the areas of spending that traditionally see rates of inflation that often can exceed the typical CPI reported rate. Again, these occur differentially across our units, and we manage them in different ways. We can return to that conversation about managing inflation if you like, but we have thought through that impact and incorporated plans to handle inflation within the budget before you today. Finally, from an overview perspective, we thought it would be useful to connect the dots in terms of the all funds budget I was just talking through and the more in-depth conversation we will have next about the funds and investments in what we call the budget framework. This picture is a way of viewing the whole budget. I'm going to start in the middle with the gold box, which is the framework funds. These are the resources we bring to your attention throughout the year and ultimately make decisions about as we develop the budget. We need to decide what to ask for from the state of Minnesota in terms of new appropriation. It doesn't just happen. And we can't do that in a vacuum. We also have to decide what to plan for tuition rates and how much of their state and tuition funds we want to ask our units to reallocate. And then in the framework, we always have this extra category at the bottom called other unit revenues. Now, moving over to the left column is where that comes into play. Under the Other Revenues heading, you will see the non-state and non-tuition funds that the units differentially generate based on their individual activities. We hold our leaders and our financial managers accountable for balancing these budgets. So the first goal for each of those other funds is to grow enough to cover the cost increases for the activities that are currently paid for by those funds. They have to pay for compensation cost increases for the staff doing that work, any inflationary costs on the supplies and materials they need to do that work, and other enhancements to their processes or methods. If any of this revenue is unrestricted and growing beyond what is needed to do what I just described, then it comes to the table to combine with the other resources in the gold box to help pay for what you see in blue, which are the same costs supported by the state appropriation and tuition. The state appropriation and tuition need to grow to cover compensation cost increases, priority initiatives, inflation, facility needs, et cetera. And if they don't grow enough, or to temper their growth, we force reallocations and we leverage that available growth in the other funds from the left column where we can in order to help pay for those things in blue that would otherwise be funded by state and tuition dollars. The result of going through a review of each item on this slide and making decisions along the way is what you have before you in the form of a full recommended budget package for FY24. In the next part of this presentation, we'll lay out the decisions we have made in that gold box and that blue box on the previous slide. Our recommendations for decisions on the budget framework items as part of that full budget package. In summary, and we'll dig into these in more detail in upcoming slides, the new incremental spending of $117.9 million, that's the blue box on that previous page, can be described in four categories. $67.7 million for the next investment in the system-wide strategic plan for compensation and for unit-level initiatives. $23.3 million to address the variance between projected and realized tuition revenue in the current year. $13.8 million for facility and technology infrastructure costs, and $13.1 million for core needs that differ within units to keep the operation moving in the right trajectory. On the resource side, in summary, how we propose to pay for that incremental $117.9 million of spending is summarized here. $55.5 million of increased state funding represents 44% of the resource plan. Close to another $48 million, or 38% of the total, would come from essentially what is not growth in state and tuition resources, and that includes reallocations, accessing the other revenues, and unit and central balances for bridging. And finally, $23.5 million, or 18.5% of the total, would come from our recommendations and estimates related to tuition. The total revenue solutions exceed the total spending increases, and I'll explain the rationale for that in just a moment. But let's spend a bit more time on the revenue side of the framework, item by item here. We'll start on the resource side with just a quick explanation of the change in the state appropriation. For FY24, as you recall, we requested increased funding for 6 different items, all recurring, totaling $122 million. Of those 6 items, we received funding for 3 of them, just over $55 million, which is 45% of what we requested. The most significant item here is the $50 million for core mission support, which is critical for helping us balance the budget in FY24. The American Indian Scholars Program, with an asterisk, is technically not appropriated to the university, so it will not be in our base appropriation going forward. Instead, it is appropriated to the Office of Higher Education for transfer to the university each year. And finally, the $1 million for safety and security will contribute to advancing the infrastructure improvements on all campuses. In addition, for FY24, we received 2 recurring items and 3 non-recurring items that we did not request in that form. Those are within the box on the slide. Of significance on the non-recurring side, we did receive $4 million in FY24 and 25 for safety and security, which we asked for recurring. So we will need to plan carefully for improvements that don't create a recurring tail for our budget. And then we also received $2 million in each year for NRRI. These non-recurring items will not carry forward as part of our base for the next biennium. Unfortunately, we received none of what we asked for in FY25. The state appropriation change is 0 for next year. As the docket materials point out, the President's recommended budget for FY24 is balanced while leaving a structural, positive, uncommitted balance in the framework funds of close to $9 million. That's the difference between the total planned spending increases, that roughly $118 million I mentioned, and the total proposed revenue increases on the summary slide we just talked through, which was about $127 million. This is an intentional plan to reserve those recurring state appropriation dollars, to not allocate them to any unit for spending on recurring items in FY24, to help address what will be cost increases in FY25. It will not be enough. Pause. But that decision to hold off on investments in FY24 to address costs in FY25 is a start of responding to that flat appropriation. So back to FY24. We next need to briefly talk through our recommendations for those other unit revenues and the internal reallocations within this proposed budget. This set of resources above the dark line is $39.5 million. So first in the gold box for FY24, units proposed to dedicate $13.4 million of available growth in those other revenues to cover costs in the framework funds. This is the piece of that far left column, the sales, the ICR, the fees, endowment earnings, et cetera, as it flows through the arrow into that center gold box on that earlier framework summary slide. Next, we have the opportunity to access $6.5 million in recurring funds units set aside this year in FY23, specifically to address cost increases in FY24. Based on our early modeling, we knew that internal cost pool charges were going to increase for most units significantly in FY24. So where possible, we asked units to budget for and reserve recurring dollars for those expenses, which led to this $6.5 million. Third, 4 units will have tuition revenue coming in above budget this year in FY23, totaling a recurring $600,000. These revenues were unanticipated and have not been committed to recurring expenses, so they can be applied to new recurring costs beginning in FY24. And finally, in the gold, we are planning the use of just $500,000 in one-time O&M balances within the units that will provide a bridge to their future revenue increases or savings. Then in addition to other revenues, we're planning $18.5 million of internal budget cuts and reallocations. As this chart shows, the level of internal repurposing of existing resources through deliberate decisions to eliminate or reduce spending is approaching a more traditional level. As noted, this chart shows only recurring reallocations in state and tuition funds, so it does not include unit decisions to reduce spending in response to inadequate revenue growth in those other revenues. But within the framework, the roughly $19 million of planned spending reductions for FY24 represents an average across all units of 1.3%, very close to FY23's amount of 1.4%. The reductions in support units average 0.7%, ranging from 0 to just over 1%, and the reductions in academic units average 1.5%, ranging from 0.3% to 5.4%. Based on early responses from units, we're expecting 74% of this to come from position eliminations and salary savings due to turnover and position restructuring, and 26% from reductions to non-compensation items. Our planning process asked each unit to propose actions that would result in spending reductions of 0.85%. As we went through the budget process and each unit's individual circumstances were reviewed, however, we arrived at a specific level proposed for each. We reviewed their unique financial issues and challenges, the tools available to address those challenges in each unit, priorities, and the impact of proposed spending reductions before settling on the final plan. The average is larger than that original target, primarily due to the need to address the significant unanticipated tuition revenue budget variances from this year without the increased state support requested to address that need. In addition to these unit-level resources for FY24, we also have a plan to use central resources on a one-time basis to bridge some significant costs. As discussed last year, the Crookston, Duluth, and Morris campuses have been hit pretty hard with enrollment-driven tuition revenue shortfalls in recent years. After factoring in that revenue loss compared to budget in FY23 and the increasing costs each campus faces for compensation and items unique to them in FY24, each was again left with a significant shortfall to balance their recurring needs. They are, however, in a better position than last year at this time, thanks in large part to the increased state appropriation. All three campuses are expected to reallocate at rates higher than the university averages, but to address the whole remaining shortfall on a relatively short planning timeframe would be very problematic. As a result, our recommendation is to provide non-recurring bridging funds totaling $2.2 million from the portion of central reserves that exceeds board policy guidelines to help balance their budgets for FY24 while allowing more time for strategic decisions moving forward. We will continue our work with the campuses to implement their cost reduction or revenue enhancement plans and will regularly monitor actual activity. A second significant need for which we recommend the use of bridging funds is the tuition revenue shortfall in three large Twin Cities colleges: the Carlson School of Management, the College of Liberal Arts, and the College of Science and Engineering. Each needs a bit more time to develop thoughtful strategies to either reduce costs or grow revenues in response to their shortfalls, which were in the $2.5 to $4 million range. Therefore, we recommend providing just over $6 million in total on a one-time basis from the roughly $9 million of state appropriation being held or reserved for recurring allocation in FY25. Moving to the final source of resources for the FY24 framework, tuition revenue, you can see from this slide that there are a number of components that make up the estimated $23.5 million gain in our proposal. The largest portion would come from the recommended 3.5% increase in rates on the Twin Cities and Rochester campuses, where there is high demand and strong enrollment potential. The recommendation for the Crookston, Duluth, and Morris campuses is for a 1% increase to continue our efforts for a larger rate differential with the Twin Cities campus. The third category of revenue associated with rate changes is that for the variety of departmental master's and certificate programs and the professional programs, each arriving at a rate proposal based on an assessment of market comparisons and enrollment demand. Attachment 3 to the budget details the specific rates in this category. Although not identified separately, there's also a component of the tuition revenue increase based on enrollment across all of these student groups. 10 units are expecting declines in total enrollment, even if the entering classes are strong, while some are expecting flat enrollment and a handful are projecting increases. And the last components of the tuition revenue change relate to the tuition surcharge that impacts students in 4 colleges today: the Carlson School of Management, the College of Science and Engineering, students with CSE majors enrolled in the College of Liberal Arts, all on the Twin Cities campus, and then the Swenson College of Science and Engineering on the Duluth campus. It will be the third of a 4-year bi-cohort phase-in plan for the Swenson College, which is not a recommended change. That additional $140,000 is simply the result of the previously approved phase-in. But in addition to that, this budget does propose to increase the Twin Cities-based surcharges from $1,250 per semester to $1,300 per semester. It's anticipated that this inflationary increase in the surcharge will not alter their rankings, both in terms of the differential itself and in terms of total cost as compared to their peers. In each case, the net surcharge revenue after scholarships is invested directly back into those colleges. A summary of the tuition rates without the surcharge is displayed on this table. It's difficult to identify a single dollar impact when there are so many different scenarios of student experience and characteristics, but it is worth noting that for the large number of students eligible, all of the tuition increase on each campus will be offset by the increased aid for those eligible from state and federal increases in Pell and the Minnesota State Grant Program. All of the rates for this year and proposed for next year are detailed in Attachment 3 to the budget, beginning on page 89 of your docket materials. In addition to the tuition rate changes, this budget incorporates a variety of changes in student fees. As occurs every year, we reviewed each proposed change to academic, course, and miscellaneous fees to ensure they are consistent with board policy. They're detailed in Attachments 6, 7, and 8 to the budget. I do want to mention that many of these fees do not cover the full expenses of the materials or activities that they support. The units must use state and tuition revenues to help cover a portion of those costs. The second category of fees is the mandatory student services fees, which are governed by a separate Board of Regents policy that calls for student input on each campus to review and ultimately recommend fee levels for a variety of activities. For FY24, you see the result of those processes in the gold table. In large part, these changes reflect increases in cost, but there are also some student service enhancements, the most notable being the addition to the fee at UMR for new recreation space, new health initiatives through the Olmsted Medical Center, and student programming through the Intercultural Center, all recommended by the campus-based committee after holding that fee flat for 8 years. Finally, as we have reported to you, our student housing and dining programs were the most severely impacted operations on each campus during the pandemic, and now they're facing significant cost increases for labor, some utilities, and particularly for food. For consistency, the rate changes proposed for FY24 included in the blue table here are generally for a double room and an unlimited meal plan where applicable, but the actual experience can definitely differ by student. The projections for occupancy vary, but since the pandemic, the occupancy has climbed for Duluth and the Twin Cities, and yet it remains below pre-pandemic levels for all campuses. In some cases, the rates are projected to cover costs, but in others, the rate changes will not replenish the loss of balances or depreciation reserves these units spent down during the pandemic, and will not even cover the costs we're estimating for FY24, so balances will be accessed one more time. Putting it all together, the tuition rate changes, the mandatory fee increases, and the room and board increases for a full-time resident undergraduate student living on campus with an unlimited meal plan, let's qualify that, the cost increase will range from roughly 2.8% to 5.2% depending on the campus. For 4 of the campuses, these increases are below the current rates of inflation. And for the Twin Cities campus, the final year of the Pioneer Hall refinance or financing plan is what is driving the increase above inflation. Without that previously approved bump of 3% for Pioneer, the Twin Cities increase on this chart would be 4.4%. All other aspects of these changes are being managed to below the current rates of inflation, which is only possible due to the bulleted actions you see in the box on this slide. And again, I want to note that for students that are eligible, the combined increase in federal and state financial assistance will offset anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of these total increases on this slide. So now's a good time to pause and summarize where we are in describing the budget. I just talked through each of the framework resource variables on this summary slide, which is just a repeat of slide 10. The incremental $126.8 million of resources in the budget comes from the increased appropriation, the unit reallocations, the growth in other revenues and use of unit and central balances, and the growth in tuition revenue from the various changes we talked through. Those are the framework. Notice I didn't mention the fees or room and board rates as part of that $126.8 million, and that's because those are part of the other revenues portion of the budget that must be balanced outside of the framework. Now let's move to a brief summary of what we propose allocating these new framework resources to. First and foremost, the priority for this budget is to invest in the strategic plan by investing in our talented faculty and staff. Going back even further than this graphic depicts, the proposed 3.75% general compensation pool increase with the additional 0.25% market adjustment pool for FY24, while below the current rate of inflation, I believe is the highest increase planned for the institution since at least the early 90s. And it certainly exceeds what we have been able to provide since FY10. A period of years in which we have had 3 different salary freezes of one sort or another, 9 years of 2 to 2.5% increases, which tried to keep pace with inflation, and 1 year that I'll call COVID recovery with a 1.5% general increase. So the 3.85% last year and the 3.75% plus 0.25% for FY24 stand out as priority investments. Across all of our funds, this increase is estimated to cost the institution over $116 million, moving our total compensation spend from $2.6 billion this year to $2.7 billion next year. Overall, 50% of the total cost increase will hit the state and tuition-funded positions. The plan calls for distribution of the 3.75% on a merit basis for the non-labor represented employee groups, incorporating the market-based adjustments where warranted into the performance and compensation review process, and then the full 4% planned for labor represented employees. Beyond compensation, the investment plan as detailed on attachment 4 to the budget includes 4 categories of recurring spending. The single largest need in the budget, outside of compensation, is to cover the tuition revenue shortfall taking shape this year. Even with a large freshman class on the Twin Cities campus, there were declines in continuing student numbers at the undergraduate level, decreased transfer and graduate student admissions, and a change in the resident versus non-resident mix of students, all compared to what was budgeted. Plus, the significant enrollment challenges continued at Crookston, Duluth, and Morris. So across all of the units, we are estimating to come in close to $23.3 million below budget. This is a recurring problem because that $23.3 million was allocated and planned to cover recurring costs this year that will continue into FY24 without changes. Although the negative swing is a large number, I think it is worth noting that the tuition budget overall was still 98% accurate, so still an A. The next 2 categories for technology and facilities and then core operations and services represent close to $27 million when combined that will go toward a variety of infrastructure costs and operating needs. Included in this list are things like the increased costs of vendor agreements on our large technology systems, utility costs, debt service increases, structural imbalances outside of the tuition shortfall, increased efforts in public safety-related recruiting and communications, increased library collection costs, and so forth. Some of these make the list every year, while others represent an ever-changing group of unique but required budget adjustments. And finally, the list of new investments includes over $6 million dedicated to a variety of programming enhancements, student aid obligations, and compliance-related items. Here again, there is a significant focus on safety and security, as well as priority investments in recruiting transfer students and supporting postdocs and faculty fellowships, for example. Only the most critical initiatives are included in the recommended funding package for FY24. Even in an environment of significant cost increases, there are choices to be made in addressing critical advancements so the institution can continue to move forward. And finally, attachment 4 also identifies non-recurring investments, some of which we have already touched on today. The largest item is the bridging funds discussed earlier in this presentation. The second item relates directly to the new non-recurring appropriations itemized on slide 13, such as the new $2 million for NRRI. The third item is a miscellaneous collection. Just as on the recurring side, each year various non-recurring needs and issues arise through the budget process that we decide are urgent and need attention. This $4.3 million includes items such as capacity increases in technology support for the Office of Information Technology, or the need to cover transitional facility operating costs for the microbial cell production facility on the St. Paul campus, and so forth. And for the fourth category, as first reported last year, the university received $7 million from the University of Minnesota Foundation as a one-time investment for strategic initiatives at the university. Managed and tracked through the president's office, 1.2 of the $7 million was invested in FY23 on campus plans and on a system-wide enrollment marketing effort. In FY24, this budget includes an additional $3.3 million for 10 items identified in your docket materials that have direct ties to the goals and commitments of Impact 2025. In closing, we believe the budget we've submitted for your review clearly supports the goals of Impact 2025. We're recommending significant support for our talented faculty and staff and additional programmatic or unit investments to ensure financial stability, to address immediate and longer-term strategic safety and security needs on all campuses, to implement the specific investments as directed by the state in connection with our increased state appropriations, to move forward in targeted areas of need and opportunity, and underlying all of this, we are proposing a continued commitment to improve efficiencies and reprioritize the work that we do to help make these advancements even more impactful. We also believe we are accomplishing this while incorporating a responsible tuition and fees plan and reasonable revenue and expenditure projections, resulting in a balanced budget. And before we turn the discussion back to you, Chair Hipsch, I would like to acknowledge the other members of my team who were instrumental in pulling this budget together. Corinne Zewers and Emily Larson are both in the audience today, and I would like to publicly thank them for their stellar work in getting us to this point. So we're all ready now to engage in a conversation and answer questions on the budget, and thank you, Chair Hipsch.
Thank you. And thank you to Senior Vice President Franz and you for the work you did on this budget. It's really amazing work. It's super complicated, and you throw in high inflation rates, and now I kind of further know why the Fed is working so hard to knock inflation back, because it affects all of us tremendously. And then we also, I can tell you from my businesses, staffing is tough right now for food service and service type workers, and we're paying them a lot more. And so to keep this budget to where it's at right now, I just want to really commend you. I know it's a lot of work, and from my standpoint, it's very, very well done, and it's a very good, fair budget for everybody, so thank you. And so we'll open this up for discussion. We first of all, to lead us off, would be Chair Verhalen, or Cody Verhalen, Regent Verhalen.
I do not want a promotion today.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, and to your point, this is dense. I mean, there's a lot of material here and over 150 pages of docket materials all in today. And so I had just 2 questions to start with, and then I'll stop and see if there's more time afterward. But the first question I have is, and I'm not sure who best to direct this to, so I will let you decide, Chair Hipsch. But the proposal in front of us is, and the recommendation in front of us is for tuition increases of the same amount, or same percentage, I should say, for both resident and non-resident tuition. And I would certainly appreciate a bit of background on the thought process that went into keeping those the same, or analysis of increasing one more than the other for purposes of the fiscal year 24 budget.
Okay. Vice President Franz.
Mr. Chair, I recommend we go to the smart one, Vice President Coniston.
Okay. Sounds good.
Sure, Chair Hipsch and Regent Verhalen, that is a good question. I would say that coming out of the pandemic, our non-resident, non-reciprocity, and international enrollments were hit hard, right? They dropped significantly. And so we have been, since that time, increasing tuition rates the same for non-resident as resident in order to try to build back that pipeline. There is evidence now that it is working for next year. We're seeing some rebound in the early confirmation numbers coming in. But we were advised by our admissions folks and those in undergraduate education that one more year at least of holding that steady growth with the resident rate would be the smart thing to do. So that is why we held it at that same rate increase.
Thank you. Follow-up, Regent Fraley?
I really appreciate that, Vice President Tonneson, and I think, we've had these discussions several times, and I think it's really important that we continue to keep a close eye on that. Obviously, our admissions teams at all of our campuses are watching those numbers very, very closely and watching the makeup of the student body at each of our campuses. But as we go forward, that's something that I would like us to continue to monitor and understand as far as where the numbers are going, where they've been, what a quote ideal mix might be for not only diversity in numbers, but diversity in interests across our system campuses. And then the other question I had, and it's a much more specific question, so I apologize for the level of specificity in my question, but on the slide around student fees and room and board rates to address cost increases, it had the gold and blue striped tables. Little bit more background around the UMR increase, just because that really jumps out on the slide. And I know there's been a lot of changes in what student services are offered at the UMR campus over the last couple years, and I'm just interested in what's driving that increase, especially not just from a percentage-wise, which jumps out, but the fee increase when compared to the other campuses.
Thank you, Vice President Tonneson.
Chair Hipsch, Regent Verhalen, the detail is actually it starts on page 115 of the docket materials, but there is a detailed listing by campus of the increases, and this is just the student services fee portion. I'm assuming that you're talking about in the gold.
Correct.
Yeah, the $418. There is a breakout. Pull it here on. Make sure I get the right campus.
I believe it's page 124,
125.
the one you're looking at.
Yeah.
Oh, yep.
125. So you see the large increase there for health and well-being. There's a large increase for recreation, and then the large increase for intercultural initiatives. And those are the three I was mentioning. And Chancellor Carroll is here. If you'd like to hear it from her, I can give you a really quick summary, but my understanding is the health and well-being represents increased health care, including mental health care services for students. The recreation is the change from the old agreement with the Y to the new recreation opportunities for students. And then the intercultural initiatives, I believe, is new programming that the students supported on the campus. So that's what's driving it. In all cases, these came up through that campus-based and student input process. So that's the best I can do. If you need more than that, we'll have to go to the on-campus expert.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I really wanted to highlight this not because of the magnitude, but to illustrate the important investments that our campuses continue to make at the request of students, at the request of faculty, at the request of administration in a lot of these really important services, and wanted to take the chance to highlight that each of these services are so important to the student body, but they all do cost money. And that's the downside of it. So unless there's someone with a blank check who is showing up to fund these as a philanthropic opportunity, the funds do need to come from somewhere to be able to provide these services to the student body.
Thank you.
That is all.
Yep.
Thank you.
Regent Davenport.
Thank you, Chair Hips. Thank you, Vice President Tonneson. I have two questions, but first I'd like to express my view that I think is embedded in the presentation for us as regents to reflect upon, and that is that my view is that we absolutely must invest in ourselves, in our students, in our future while we are cutting. We absolutely have to. So that's my statement. My first question is about reserves. And I see that we're accessing reserves. Do we have kind of a floor and a ceiling of what our expectations are for the amount of reserves we have by unit. That's one question. I'll just give you my second. And that is about structural imbalances within units and how are the units being worked with in terms of doing a quick turnaround on those structural imbalances and accountability in that work.
Thank you, Regent. Vice President Tonneson?
Chair Hips, Regent Davenport. First on the reserves, we struggle with this over time because the units are looking for guidelines too. How large should our reserves be? How should they be categorized and held? And quite honestly, in our budget model, the risk is distributed differently across units, and so there isn't a single answer to that question. For administrative units, that there is very little, if to no, revenue risk because they are given their budget and they stay within it every year. So in those cases, we recommend reserves, I'm going to say under 10% of their expenditures just to handle the annual flexibility needs within your budget. That in combination with staff turnover tends to be enough to allow them to address their needs during the year. When you get into the academic side where there are a variety of revenues involved, again, depending on the unit, that revenue risk varies. So there is a revenue risk for tuition, and you're seeing that here. The 3 large schools with the large numbers that we're proposing to use university reserves to help cover, that's that tuition revenue risk. We could ask them to spend down all of their reserves for that, but because we have the available central reserves, our proposal is to help them. But there are other revenues that have a more regular trajectory of growth or decline where there's a little bit less risk, and others with even more. So it just really depends on the unit. There you're going to see variations. If they have been spending down balances, they might only have 10%, and we're going to work with them to try to build the reserve. And others that have had good years might be up at 30% of expenditures or even a little bit higher. So we monitor that. We actively manage those balances every year as part of this budget process. What I mean by that is we consider those levels of balances as we make decisions about their budgets and what they can and can't handle. And that gets a little bit more towards your second question on the structural imbalance. So it isn't unusual for a unit to have a structural imbalance for a period of a couple of years, and then they're out of it, and then 5 years later they might have it again. And it's because of that flow of revenues and expenditures. So we work with them when they're starting to develop these problems to catch it early, to say, what are your balances? What are your unrestricted reserves? How can you use those to bridge to the decisions you have to make to right size, which might be reduced expenditures above what we're planning for most units in the budget and increased revenues. So we work with them over a period of time to eliminate that. The examples we've been talking with you about most publicly recently have been Crookston, Duluth, and Morris, where we have some processes in place to work with them to provide information as necessary, advice as necessary, to help them develop plans to get out of that situation over the next several years. And then we monitor and we keep track of it. In past years, we were very public about the law school's structural imbalance that took a number of years to move out of. Dentistry, I mean, it just kind of goes around the institution, and it's a normal part of our budget management process. So.
Follow up?
Thank you. I think it's really important to recognize the importance of reserves, that we need to have those both at the unit level and university-wide so that we can accommodate for these issues and correct them as you are doing and working with the units. Thank you.
Well said. Student Representative Davis.
Thank you, Chair Hipsch, and as well Vice President Tonneson, who always does a fantastic job at answering everybody's very specific questions. So I also wanted to thank both of you again. I have some extensive comments here on behalf of the student body. So again, thank you to everyone in the room for bearing with me over Zoom while I go through all of my points here. But we appreciate the continued efforts on behalf of the university to keep tuition below inflation. Though for our students, 3.5% is still a high burden. As students, we would like to see the university explain further and work with students to show how the budget affects them. Tuition is increasing by 3.5%, but student services account for just 3.3% of the proposed budget for fiscal year 2024. And that burden also does grow when we note that the room and board fees have increased, as well as additional other fees that students pay into the university. So we hear specifically from students that even though they pay a significant amount of fees, it's sometimes more difficult to see exactly where those go and how those are used. The student service fee is usually sometimes can be as a result of the advocacy that we do, so something like the Universal Transit Pass. But again, we hear from students that sometimes academic fees are specifically a little bit more difficult to understand. We know College of Design students have, I think, nearly double the fees of other students, but many of them still pay significant out-of-pocket supply costs for class materials or for software. So we ask that the university continue to work with students to implement feedback and ensure that fees are doing what we say that we're doing, and promising that we're supporting students with them and that they don't pose an additional financial burden. And then we also noted on page 60 of the docket materials, the university does recommend some cutting some marketing costs. But I agree with the point that Regent Hipsch has been making, I think, throughout this whole year, that given the potential enrollment cliff that we're facing, we also still need to focus on student recruitment, which includes marketing, that could prevent some further tuition hikes there. And lastly, I also wanted to note we're thrilled to see the free college program that was enacted by the state legislature this year that's noted in the budget. We hope that the university will cooperate extensively with the Office of Higher Education to ensure that University of Minnesota students can fully benefit from this program as it was intended. And then we also appreciate the funding that grants access to free menstrual products in all of the campus buildings. That's going to do a lot to decrease period poverty that students are facing. So we sincerely appreciate the work that the state legislature has done on those elements to support students. Looking forward to the future, we'd like to hear more from university officials and particularly central administration on what the budget specifically means for students. We're key stakeholders in the university, and as we look to fiscal year 2025, students would appreciate further opportunities to share what we need from the university. So thank you.
Thank you, Student Representative Davis. Vice President Tonneson, any comments? Okay. Senior Vice President France?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Student Representative Davis. We really appreciate your thoughtful comments, and it's always helpful to hear. One of the things, as I mentioned, are starting next week on the proposed budget for 2025. We will be engaging with student representatives over the summer, along with faculty and staff, because you're so right. I mean, I think one of the things that we always learn in these conversations is perspectives that we don't always appreciate the sensitivity and the concern about. I mean, the menstrual equity issue is a really great example of something that was developed that's really an important mission for us to support going forward. But in general, thank you for your comments, and we'll make sure that we get the right kind of representation and engagement this summer. I know it's summertime, but nonetheless, our work continues, and we look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senior Vice President. Regent Gully.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to start by taking a moment to thank our legislators for the work that they did on helping us to get funding for some of the things that we needed. I'm so excited to see that we have support for unemployment for a lot of folks who have been excluded for decades from unemployment. And I also agree that I'm really excited to see menstrual products on our campus and funded, and that is just a really important step toward equity on our campuses. And so and so many other things, but those things I think in particular feel like they could have been continued to be unfunded for a long time, and they got some attention this year, and that was really exciting. I find myself wondering this a lot. Would it be possible to have, I know how complicated it is to see what people actually pay, but would it be possible to have some kind of breakdown that shows sort of like average of what people pay, what students actually pay based on different incomes, based on resident, non-resident, and maybe if there are other factors that I can imagine. And I don't need it to be like an exact, but it would be really helpful because I know that these numbers that we have in here don't reflect what people actually pay and what kind of debt they're taking on. So is it possible to do that?
Vice President Tonneson, do you have any comment? Yep.
Yes, Chair Hipsch, Regent Gully. Yeah, we have at various points in time created charts, again with qualifications because there are as many scenarios as there are students practically. But we have created charts that show, here's your tuition and fees, for example, and if you're in different income levels, what is the sort of typical math that you might pay. We haven't as much done average. There's no average, but we can give you scenarios of what it could look like for different students in different categories. And again, it depends on if they live on campus or not live on campus, and how do you count all of that. But we can do scenarios if that would be helpful.
That would be really helpful. And also, if we could talk about how much debt a typical student is. I mean, I know there's no typical student, but how much debt our students are taking on to pay for those things, that would be really helpful too.
Yep.
Vice President France?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Hibbs, and thank you, Regent Gully. I think that's a good point. What we'll do with the scenarios is show both the kind of different scenarios that you can see, but also show the student debt. One of the things, our trend has been down more and more is to have less debt for students, but that doesn't make a lot of difference to the student who has the debt, right? So we want to give you some examples of that as well. But, I want to support your thank you for the legislature for giving us some of these items. But one of the things I wish they would have given us was the tuition support, because the tuition support would have gone dramatically toward reducing debt for students, and even more so going forward. So there's always plenty to work on next year, I should say, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, Regent Mayeron.
Thank you. I have a question, and has to do with the three colleges that, on the one hand, we have a surcharge over the normal tuition rate for undergrad. That is the Carlson School of Management. If I have this wrong, you'll let me know. The College of Science and Engineering, and then within CLA, some of the within CLA departments or majors that track with either the Carlson School of Management or the College of Science and Engineering. So, and I had understood that we had the recommendations for a surcharge for increased tuition for those schools was because of demand, that the demand within those schools warranted in the market charging more than our standard tuition rate. On the other hand, if I'm understanding correctly, we are talking about using some non-reoccurring funds to address structural imbalances within, and I have this wrong, you're going to correct me, or address issues within those very same colleges. And I'm trying to understand if demand is up in those colleges such that it would support an increased tuition rate, why at the same time we are seeing they need help to address some imbalances, which apparently could be driven by less than they had less transfers or enrollment was somehow affected. So I hope you understand, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, if I've got the wrong assumptions here, but I'm trying to understand on the one hand why we're increasing tuition, on the other hand, they need a helping hand.
Vice President Tonneson.
Chair Hibbs, Regent Mayeron. No, you've got it. It's a good question. the College of Science and Engineering and their majors and the Carlson School of Management have historically and recently had higher demand than other programs, right? And so that still holds, and their classes, their freshman classes are strong. What we saw this year was a drop compared to budget, not in total, but compared to what was planned, not from the entering class, but from retention rates, from transfer students, and from graduate. And for example, the Carlson School of Management, it is primarily the graduate enrollment that has dropped. The surcharge applies only to undergraduate students. So that's, and similarly for College of Science and Engineering, they have a higher proportion of graduate students than many colleges, and so that drop in graduate enrollment combined with the other pieces led to some large number drops in revenue compared to budget. So what we're recommending is, first of all, on the surcharge side, just an inflationary increase. It's not a change. It rounds to 4% when you try to keep it an even number, but it is meant to follow the tuition rate increase as an inflationary type of increase. But the non-recurring proposal we have for them is because the numbers were large. They're at $2.5 to $3.5 to $4 million of tuition revenue loss this year, and to ask them to find that amount of recurring expense reduction or revenue increases to cover that in a very short period of time was problematic. And so this is a bridge. We're just giving them we're proposing to give them the non-recurring dollars. They still have to solve it, recurring and going forward. So they're still going to have to reduce expenses or take advantage of that increased tuition revenue as it starts coming in to backfill that. But it's a delay of those actions that we are asking for, again, because the numbers were large. But the demand is still there. They're surpassing their freshman target numbers as of today.
Okay, thank you. Excellent explanation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Regent Kenyanya.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Brief comment before I get to my question. In an earlier exchange, I'm forgetting who we were talking about, structural deficits, and I think I would just say that, when we discuss those, to not necessarily discuss them as unit or exclusively unit issues, because I think then we think the same way when we talk about solutions, right? I think the units bear responsibility, but those of us in this room on both sides bear responsibility for getting there and also for the solution. I mean, I think those are definitely things the board and administration have to own as well. So to my question, Vice President Tonneson, I'm looking at in our docket, it's 139, but this is the slide with the interconnectedness between the budget. I see green and blue, and is that gold?
Is that a Kermit the Frog song?
I trust she'll find it. Yes, thank you. Yes, perfect. So I'm looking at this slide and definitely aware of how interconnected our budget is on the back end, especially. But I guess I'm looking for some help understanding this and how different things flow, and I'll explain why. Because when I look at, especially on the far left, for example, I mean, the simplest one is gifts. As President Schmidlkoffer, who was here, will tell you, I mean, most of those are usually directed, right? And you don't have a lot of freedom in terms of what you can do with those. We have fees on here, the student service fee. That's a very student-involved process where you can go and see exactly where everything is going, right? I mean, it's pretty well directed. Course fees have their purpose. And then even on auxiliary, if someone's paying for room and board, they'd expect that that's where it's going. And if there was somehow a surplus, then maybe their rate should be adjusted or their amenities increased. So just help me understand how those play into the interconnectedness.
Sure. Chair Hipsch, Regent Kenyanya, great question. This is a part of the thing I could talk about for a very long time. So, but I won't. It's a very good question, and it's difficult without, looking at it from on high and at the detail level to understand. So we do, let me take your first example, gifts. They're 98, 99% restricted.
Yeah.
99% restricted to a unit. But one thing I want to mention on this whole page is we do it first at the unit level. So your point about it isn't just at the unit level, we come in at the central level to help too is very valid. But first we look at the unit level. And if they're gifts, if it's restricted endowment earnings, auxiliaries, fees that are for very particular purposes, they stay within the units to pay for the cost increases and the cost related to those activities. It's not going to go somewhere else. It's not going to go onto through that arrow to help pay for the O&M costs. But there are unrestricted revenues in this category that the units can use, and they do use. ICR is a big one, right? So if grants are growing and they don't have commitments against that growth in the ICR revenue, they have an opportunity, that's unrestricted money, to move expenses that otherwise would have been paid for by state and tuition dollars onto that growing revenue source, that ICR. They can move expenses. They can move, let's say they were paying for a departmental admin person who helps with grants, as an example. If they were paying for that person on O&M and all of a sudden their grant activity is really growing and their ICR grows, they can say, I'm going to put 50% or 100% of that person over on the ICR funds and take the burden off of the state and tuition dollars. That's just an example. But in each case, they have to look at what type of revenue it is, any restrictions around that revenue, what it should be used for appropriately, as in your example of the fees, and whether or not there are legitimate examples where that expense transfer can happen. But that's how those revenues help support the framework, is when there's uncommitted growth that's unrestricted and appropriate and available, they can move expenses over there. And that's how we leverage the growth in those other revenues. For many years, this board has talked about we need to grow those other revenues, we need to advance them. That's to pay for growth in the excellence of what we do. It's to increase scope, but it's also to help take some of the burden off of tuition and state money. So does that answer your question?
Mr. Chair, it answers a lot of it, and that makes sense, right? If there's a gift that can support this faculty member,
yes,
that frees up some of that. So that makes sense. Just quick follow-ups. When we talk about unit, what does that mean? Because does that mean, because I know a campus is a unit, at least budget-wise, right? So there's still a lot of latitude within that, and then with respect to auxiliary services that are 100% self-supported, when would it make sense? When would we see those funds move out of the auxiliary service?
Sure. Chair Hips, Regent Kenyanya. For auxiliaries, great point. We do not increase auxiliary rates to support anything beyond the costs of those activities. We're not making money on auxiliaries. And as I tried to point out in the presentation, they're actually not even covering their full cost increases right now. So, and that would be true for fees as well. We don't raise fees to support other costs. That we follow that very closely and make sure that they justify their cost increases for the activities the fee is for. So I want to make sure everyone understands that. We do not raise those student-related charges to push that revenue elsewhere within the institution. So that doesn't happen. Your question on units is also a good one. From our perspective, so from the large 30,000-foot look, we have 50 RRCs, Resource Responsibility Centers, that are units that we hold accountable for their financial activity. However, within each one of those, so the Crookston campus is one of those, the College of Design mentioned earlier is another one, right? But within those, they have departments, they have centers, they have, quote, other units within them. And the revenue, some of these other revenues, for example, often flow directly to that lower level unit, depending on the activity we're talking about. Not all of it. So the ICR, for example, that goes to the college or the campus, and they decide then how to distribute it down. But if there's sales income or gift income for a particular thing, endowment earnings for a particular position, chair, those go directly to that lower level unit within the RRC. So again, I apologize, it is complicated and complex, but that is the reality. It's very bifurcated like that.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, our final question comes from Regent Turner.
Yes, thank you, Chair Heaps. I would like to throw my support behind what Student Representative Davis had said. One of her points was about, and I think I've alluded to this before, it also does not make sense to me that we would decrease the amount of money that is spent on marketing and advertisement, especially to the greater Minnesota universities. Unless we're finding a cheaper way to do it and produce more product, that's a whole nother ballgame. But I just feel that with the decreased enrollment in those greater Minnesota campuses, that we need a more equitable and way of spending those dollars so that we can help to increase their enrollment. I agree with Representative Davis, Student Representative Davis, that it just doesn't make any sense.
Okay, thank you.
And I'd like it, either an explanation or a different look at that.
Senior Vice President, or Vice President Thompson.
Chair Hips, Regent Turner, that line that she referenced was an example of something that a unit submitted as their proposed reduction. I can't tell you sitting here today exactly what it is, but I can find out. I mean, we can provide that later. There is no attempt here to reduce overall marketing, or certainly on the system-wide enrollments level. It could be, for example, a unit had turnover or a loss of a position in that communications area that they are choosing not to fill, or they're choosing to fill it differently. And so that's what they submitted as part of their planned cost reduction. But we can find out specifically what that is. It was just one example within the overall budget.
Follow
Chair,
up? Yep.
Chair Heaps, I'm glad I brought it up then, because then now the students hopefully have a better understanding of what that line item is.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it can look more dire than what it is.
Good. Well, thank you for your presentation. Thanks for the great dialogue and questions, and we're going to take a 10-minute break. So.
Happy to share those. Everything's on CDs.
I love this gavel.
Are you gonna break this one too?
New gavel, new person. So, okay, call the Finance and Operations Committee back to order. Our next item is an update on strategic property and campus planning. Assistant Vice President Leslie Krieger, Interim Chancellor David McMillan, Director of Planning Monique McKenzie, and Chief Sustainability Officer Shane Stennis are here to provide the update. Senior Vice President Franz, would you like to get us started?
I would love to. Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you know from the materials, this item is made up of two components. The first one is we will have Assistant Vice President Krieger provide an update on the efforts of the Strategic Property Work Group. For those of you who've been here for a while, and for you new folks, last fall, we developed this work group to lead the board to help make determinations about the acquisition and disposition of properties and to bring those actions to this board for your consideration. So Assistant Vice President Krieger will do that. Then second, we're here to provide an update on our campus planning work. The system-wide strategic plan, Impact 2025, calls for an updated campus and climate action plan for each of our campuses. In May, we provided an overview of the Twin Cities Climate Action Plan, which was built on the foundation of the Twin Cities Campus Plan that was issued in December of 2021. Now, as we did with the Twin Cities materials, we're really excited to share the work we've done thus far in the second series of plans that are now focused on the Duluth campus. Today, we bring you a draft framework and a preliminary recommendations for planning and sustainability on the Duluth campus. Your docket material includes a longer, more detailed set of slides to provide depth and context to the material today. But our presentation today is going to be focused on that subset of those slides to allow as much time as possible for your guidance, feedback, and direction on this planning. Our team will use that input from the board to inform what their plans to bring forward to you a review and action plan this fall. So I'll turn it over to Assistant Vice President Krieger, if that's all right, Mr. Chair.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Hipsch, members of the committee. As Senior Vice President Franz noted, the majority of our time today will be spent providing the board with an overview of the UMD Campus Plan and Climate Action Plan framework. But before we proceed with UMD, I will give you a brief update as to the work of the Strategic Properties Work Group. To orient new members of the board, MPAC 25 directs the administration to establish a land retention, acquisition, and use strategy. As part of the implementation of this action item, in May 2022, the Regents adopted guiding principles for real estate transactions as part of their real estate and facilities policy. At last summer's board retreat, we had a robust discussion regarding real estate priorities, which led to the Regents' resolution in September directing the President to form the Strategic Properties Work Group. The Strategic Property Work Group meets regularly to review our real estate strategy in alignment with those Regents' guiding principles. Each potential acquisition and disposition is weighed against those principles and helps the administration prioritize the real estate office's work plan. This slide provides an overview of the recent acquisitions and dispositions that the board has acted upon since last fall and previews some of the upcoming transactions you will see in the coming year. For example, our recent transactions include supporting the future clinical campus expansion on the eastern edge of the Twin Cities campus, the Dinkytown restaurant property, and properties in Moore County to support the farm initiative. In the coming year, we hope to be reviewing with the board 2 land exchanges, as well as some significant property dispositions. Now we'll turn it over to UMD. MPAC 25 also includes direction to establish a new long-term physical comprehensive plan for each campus, as well as direction to establish a next-generation system-wide campus climate action plan for 2030. UMD is the first system campus to combine the physical campus planning process with climate action planning. We will begin the Rochester combined campus planning and climate action planning process later this fall, and followed by Crookston and Morris in the coming years. We create physical campus plans for each of our campus to address questions of growth, capital renewal, and the interaction with the surrounding community, all based on the priorities shaped by the institution's teaching, research, and outreach mission. Campus plans are aspirational in nature, while at the same time providing pathways for directing new construction, renovation, divestment, and demolition. By combining the campus planning and climate action planning processes, we have the opportunity to strengthen the alignment of our goals for climate neutrality by 2050 with our physical planning efforts. Future 6-year capital plans identifying specific projects as well as funding sources are examples of how campus plans and the climate action plan will be implemented. The near-term horizon for the UMD coordinated campus and climate action plans is 15 years through 2038. Other recommendations for physical change are linked to long-term horizon of 30 years to 2053 to ensure that the physical place that is UMD will capture our aspirations, serve the community, and advance UMD's goals.
Thank you. Good morning.
Morning.
Members of the board and Chair Hipsch. Nothing gets me out of bed in a better mood than a chance to talk about the world of Bulldogs and UMD. So I get the opportunity to do that this morning, and what a blessed opportunity it is. So I'm going to start way up here with a couple of kind of strategic observations and impact observations about UMD, then spend just a little bit of time making sure the whole board has the same level of context about some of the let's call them vital statistics for UMD. When I was here in December, I ran through some of those, but several of you weren't here in December, so I think it behooves everybody for me to make sure folks know size and challenges and those sorts of things. But UMD sits, as this map shows, in the middle of a largely residential area. To the right there in that map, to the east, I guess, a tremendous amount of relatively recent commercial development. But as Monique comes along behind me, I would pull up for you on this map. Note where we sit there between a couple of very big, very important green spaces in Duluth, Hartley, and the Chester Park with our own Bagley Nature Preserve right behind us, because she'll talk about how all that might connect. But thinking about a residential neighborhood is largely where UMD is, but a lot of recent commercial development to the east that's quite impressive. So on to UMD. We are unique with this university as a part of it as both a land and a Sea Grant research institution, and the Sea Grant elements sit right on the lower southeast corner of campus there. The significance to Duluth is remarkable. Learning, research, and outreach, all three parts of our mission occur right on campus. Some of it occurs around Duluth as well, but make no mistake, UMD is a community and regional hub for art, music, theater, history, athletics, lots of athletics right on campus, some of it downtown, but all those things matter to the community. Where we sit and where we are is important. We support directly or indirectly more than 4,000 jobs in the Duluth community, and UMD's Bureau of Business and Economic Research estimated about nearly $600 million of annual indirect and direct economic impact for the region. So I share that so that you get a sense of what does UMD mean to Duluth, what does it mean to northeastern Minnesota. It means a lot, and where it sits and what it looks like in 15 years matters not only to this university and you as its regents, but to the entire community there in the region. So flipping then to the site itself, 128-year history. It's long, and started as a normal school in 1985, Duluth State Teachers College in 1921, and then became a coordinate campus of this system in 1947. Virtually all of the academic activity, research, outreach, and education occurs on the campus proper, but there's a little bit of the old normal school and the Teachers College just off campus. When you come up north to see it, we'll show you that, but you can think that's the research lab that's just a couple blocks away. But everything's there. 50 buildings, 250 acres, spectacular overlook of Lake Superior, and again abutted on the north by the Bagley Nature Center, which most campuses would die to have something like that right there, a wooded area right in town. Total enrollment, 9,700 students roughly, supported by about closer to 1,700 staff. And of that 9,700, the number, as I told you in December, it's at almost 7,800 undergraduates. That's key. And about just shy of 600 graduate students, and then, of course, medical, pharmacy, and some non-degree seeking students. So why all that? Why that today in a campus master planning conversation? Because UMD is a place-based institution, and I think that's the way you need to think about it. Obviously, we have, along with the rest of the industry and this system, become very multimodal. But UMD bread and butter is undergraduate, resident, or place-based education. So about 94% of our students are full-time students and average age of about 20. And now I'll cut just a couple more of these vital statistics. 85% of that number comes from Minnesota, about 50% of that from the Twin Cities, and another almost a little more than 35% from greater Minnesota, another 10% adding on to that 85 from Wisconsin, and that gets you pretty close to the total number of students. So you get a sense of where we draw from and how we use this place-based, the wonder that is UMD to pull those in. First generation students, about 26% and 20% Pell eligible, and about 14% right now BIPOC. So housing matters in this plan a ton. And it's our goal, and we're largely able to meet that, to house all of our first-year students on campus. The total capacity of on-campus housing is about 1,800 residential style, traditional residential halls, and another 1,100 in apartment-style housing. And we're not quite able to fit all of the students in a good year where we want to be with enrollment in those older residence halls. So we've got a few of that getting into the apartment-style housing. But think of 10,000 students roughly, and a third of them can be housed on campus. And we've got some real needs in that area that'll come up as we talk about it. Last comment from me about this is that research matters too on this campus, and research facilities matter. If you take all of the non-R1 public universities in Minnesota and Wisconsin and combine them, they still don't have as much research going on as UMD does, as the #2 research center in this state for non-academic medicine work. 70 million, approaching 75 million of sponsored research activity on campus. So that's a driver. And then a word about sustainability. Our estimated FY23 spend on energy, about $5.5 million with our utility, our electric utility, which is headed for, I think they're at 50% renewable today and headed for, I think, 100 in 10 or 20 years. But I think $5.5 million there, and about 2.5, a little over that, with the city of Duluth, which is our gas supplier. So that's where our money goes. And as Monique brings this thing to life, you'll get a sense of just what an important role a transition to a cleaner energy future means. We've reduced, we're proud of this, I think Monique will talk about this as well, but about a 28% reduction in our carbon footprint since 2007, when the baseline was established, and building energy consumption use is down about 22%. Finally, I want to compliment this team and Sasaki for the level of and commitment to and depth of engagement that they provided our campus. Lots of opportunity for everybody to engage, and it's not always easy to do, and not everyone's in Duluth on campus many, many times. Students, staff, faculty, online, in-person opportunities, some surveys, lots of surveys actually. So I think this is a nicely informed plan. I'll close with the word aspirational, and when I come back to make final remarks, that's another one. Not to get you thinking, we're not headed this way, but you need to keep that word in mind because there's a lot packed into this. Thank you.
Chair Hipsch, thank you. Chancellor McMillan. When we do these planning efforts, as we'll do them across the system, we really start with thinking about analysis. What do we know about current conditions? What do we know from stakeholders who are on those campuses? How might we envision a future really starting from an analytical point of view? So we end up aspirational, but we start very grounded in data and comments, that we hear from those campus communities. There are detailed references about this in your docket material. We also consider trends affecting other campuses across the country, pages 178 to 85 if you didn't get there. And as the Chancellor himself just mentioned, we really are very committed to engagement from the beginning of the process around these plans. We need to understand those aspirations, priorities, concerns, challenges coming from students, from faculty and staff. We have more detail coming. You'll see it. You probably already have seen it in your docket, and I know the Chancellor agrees, but with that effort comes a lot of ownership, a lot of sense of homegrown, that this work itself, but also the outcomes and recommendations of the work, really reflect how the Duluth community sees its future. Next slide, please. So when we begin, we've taken 4 themes here from your docket to talk about at this presentation. And the fundamental one really, of course, is campus life. UMD's buildings are deeply interconnected. If any of you have recent experience or experienced once upon a time, it's still the same. You can go almost anywhere indoors, which is a terrific gift for much of the year in Duluth, of course. But we think about it also from a student life experience. So if you look in the graphic on the left-hand side with the yellow buildings, the housing neighborhoods are up there at the top of the hill. And most students, most days, make their way through the Duluth complex. Many of them end up at rec, not always outdoor rec, but rec in green that you see on the right-hand side of that diagram. And in between, woven through, is the academic and research and social life of campus. So when we think about campus life, we understand how it sits on the land. We understand how people move through it. We have continued to reinvest in those features of student life for housing, for dining, for rec, throughout the life of campus. We started building here in 1954. Many buildings have continually received that investment. Some have not. So one key finding out of our work thinking about what it means to live on campus is thinking about student health. And student health service support comes in many forms, but particularly bricks and mortar. Currently, the Student Health Service resides in Provost's old residence, right at the top of the hill in the residential neighborhood. It's one of the buildings in red there to the left-hand side of your diagram. It is inadequate to the size. It needs to be about twice as big as it is to support a campus of 9,000 to 10,000 students, which is where we consistently see Duluth. So that's one very strong requirement. Most of the rest of our requirements, as you'll see, are about reinvesting in the fabric that's there. When we think about campuses and we think about people living on campuses, we devote a lot of time and attention to landscape. So what is the role of open space in supporting our campus operations, how people experience the campus? The cost of campus operations is a very important lens for all of us to consider. In the case of Duluth, it's a tremendous opportunity to use open spaces in a multitude of ways. Not every campus has that opportunity. And if you've seen the docket, you know that we're about to tell you we are excited about opportunities for thermal energy systems going in places that are either now open space or in the future could be open space. Another piece of landscape here in this framework plan we're thinking about is how we can green this campus. And we can green this campus particularly along its edges. So how do you enter the campus, exit the campus? How can we make that green experience for the months we have it very attractive, whether we're on foot, by bike, and of course always by transit. And there's a couple key features in our big ideas coming on that. The last piece is the stormwater responsibilities we have. We're at the top of the hill. Minnesota law urges us to consider these responsibilities, and so we do. We need to treat water where it falls. And so today on the Duluth campus, there's a whole coterie of stormwater management features, but this greening effort we're proposing would allow us to do more which supports growth, but to do more which actually supports the whole region, the city, and the region. And any of you who remember floods, which will continue to happen as climate continues, more we can do at the top of the hill, better for everyone involved, not just the downstream folks. Next. When we think about campus changes, we also think about mobility and mode share, and by that we mean how do people travel to campus. So those daily trips by all people who are coming to campus really affect us. They require us to use land in certain ways. They require us to remove snow for a long part of the year. The fact in Duluth with winter conditions and honestly with the transit service available is we have limitations on how people will come to and from campus that are different than other regions, perhaps like the Twin Cities. Overall, we still have a high proportion of people who are not traveling by single occupant vehicle, but you see from the graph here, the students and the faculty travel quite differently. That has a lot to do with, of course, where people live and what kind of service, transit service, they can access. I was reminded by my colleagues in Duluth that working with the Duluth Transit Authority, there's been tremendous luck rerouting and targeting transit service to neighborhoods where we know students live and we know some staff live. And so service to those neighborhoods has resulted in an uptick in transit use. However, it's very difficult to serve the entire staff population, 1,700 people who live really across the region. So we continue to see those gains. We believe that our findings are really focused on how do we keep the transit share high, how do we support when those choices to drive a vehicle will remain, as we believe they will in large part. Things like electric vehicles, charging stations to really bring confidence and assurance about those who are going to use electric vehicles to travel to and from campus. So then the last piece of this portion of our analysis is really about parking and how we're using parking. And again, for all the reasons I just mentioned about the choices that are actually available to people, parking is not going to disappear. Think of the current scenario on the left side of the screen. But we do believe we can continue to manage how many park permits we're selling and how those permits are used based on time of day and location on the campus. So we have no intention of digging up all the surface parking lots, but you'll see as we come back to you later on that we're talking about how the trips are made, where structured parking might be a viable option, and how we can continue to take a close look at this. It is a significant driver of resources and experience on campus. I'm going to turn over to Shane and talk us through some of the climate impact.
Great. Chair Hipsch, members of the board, it's good to be here with you this morning. Like campus planning, climate planning really begins with an assessment of the current state. And as we shared with the board last month, in order to adequately respond to climate change and to realize our goal around building a fully sustainable future that we've articulated in MPACT 2025, we need to make our campuses resilient to the anticipated effects of climate change. We also need to eliminate the carbon pollution and other emissions that emanate from the delivery of our mission and contribute to climate change. And we have to do both these things incredibly quickly. From a resilience standpoint, the Duluth campus is in a really strong position. The region and the city have received national attention as a potential climate refuge. And as the chancellor pointed out earlier, as a place-based institution, that's a real asset for us and also something that we can really respond to. But that doesn't mean that there won't be climate change impacts. Those impacts are described on page 184 of your docket materials. And those impacts are going to be particularly important for us to respond to through many of the strategies and opportunities that Monique had just highlighted in some of the questions around landscape treatment and how we move people around and the energy systems. Regarding emissions, UMD, as the chancellor has also noted, reduced its emissions almost 30% since 2007. Those emissions come from a variety of different sources, like we talked with you last month regarding the Twin Cities climate plan. Transportation-related emissions, for example, which are mostly captured in the wedge on this pie graph on the slide as labeled Scope 3, are certainly one component of the work. And the analysis Monique just shared regarding opportunities to support people in moving around differently than they do today will be an important aspect of how we manage those emissions and begin to reduce them. Additionally, as you can see from the information on the slide, emissions from electricity we consume to power everything from lights to computers to equipment, and the natural gas that we burn to heat the campus, which are labeled as Scope 2 and Scope 1 respectively on the chart, they make up the most significant portion of UMD's emissions. Reducing the emissions associated with energy use for these purposes by changing the source of the energy and using less energy through efficiency and conservation will be extremely critical. Now I'm going to pass it back to Monique to talk about engagement.
Chancellor addressed the engagement, many surveys, I think, was the phrase he used. And indeed, that's exactly what we did, because we really wanted to hear from that set of stakeholders, almost 700 responses, with thousands of specific points of reference about what matters to them on campus, right? So where do they eat, where do they study or work, class, play, et cetera. And so understanding the geography of how people experience campus has had a lot to do with our findings and has really made a steady contribution to how we framed up the big ideas. We used a number of other tools, which we're happy to get into detail with you as you wish to know more. We really need to communicate about hopes for the future with this complex type of material at multiple levels, in multiple forums, in multiple modes, because we just will not reach everyone using one tool only, so that's exactly what we've done. Next slide. So I'm just going to transition us to something, a section of the plan that we call Big Ideas. And it sounds maybe too simplistic, but it's really a way to think of it succinctly. Within each big idea, there are multiple recommendations. So that's really what's been exciting for us in the last 8 to 9 months of work we've been doing at UMD about thinking of the joint opportunities that are offered. In this case, because of the attributes already existing for Duluth campus, we have the chance to deeply integrate some climate action strategies with that maintained distinctive physical presence for the campus. So it's been very exciting for us. We'll go on, next slide, please, to talk about the first big idea, the big idea, which is something that I don't believe in my knowledge of campus planning for Duluth has emerged before, which is to think about the campus and its contributions to the city, as the Chancellor noted, which are very measurable in some cases, in a very qualitative and natural systems kind of way. And I think it's really fascinating, and this is the benefit of bringing in consultants who see things we don't, right, and making these connections. So they were continually struck by the idea of connecting really important dots in the city of Duluth, if you will, between Hartley Park to the north at the upper part of this diagram, and Chester Park at the south. And I know Chester Park better than Hartley Park, but it is a gorgeous piece of land in the city of Duluth, and it's a public place. And how can we make campus connect better? Not with a roadway necessarily, but with an actual navigate your way through, whether you're on a bike, you're on foot, what have you. So this feature of this big idea is a great gift. It's a gift for the campus, but it's because it means from campus you can go to these places, but it's a gift for the city as well. The second piece of this big idea about a sustainability corridor is what we call the heart. And the heart is highlighted in a red glow in the middle. But if you know the campus, you know Kirby Drive, you know Kirby Center. It is absolutely the busiest place on campus on most days. That's where the students are. It's a prime transit feature on that corridor. So being able to make that corridor more transit, less vehicle, with amplified ped and walking is another really important part of this corridor. Other components, which is not relocation, but continued investment expansion, dining sits there, and dining is the bridge up to the housing neighborhood. So reinforcing that connection is another really big part of Big Idea 1. The second big idea is the park on the southeast corner of campus. So now we're further to the east at College Street and Woodland really is, for most of us coming to visit campus for the day, our primary approach. There are fields there today, so it's not a radical change, but reorganizing, rebuilding these fields to suit the recreational needs on campus is a big part of this. While doing so, being able to provide a pedestrian entry that's much greener and much more inviting and much more of a signal that this is an entrance to campus. Some terrific work was done up Woodland Avenue as the new commercial development across Woodland was built, but this is a next level of investment. And the remarkable opportunity here that I've been teasing you with is that this is a terrific place for us to pursue geothermal exchange systems, and Shane will talk about that more. But in building out those systems, we then would rebuild these fields to really suit the current student life rec needs on campus. The third big idea is really about greening the campus edge, and so this is, we understand that it may seem strange to retract some of our footprint from the other side of Skyline Parkway at the north side of campus, from the edges where Skyline meets College on the west, but that is exactly what we're trying to do. So you see a tag at the top of that diagram that says reforestation. For example, those are sites where a number of the upper year student apartments are located. They are built in the 80s and 90s. They are nearing the end of their useful life. Our proposal, as they do get to the end of their useful life, is to relocate them to the purple sites you see located inbound of the Skyline Parkway. So we're talking about making some of the housing features more compact. By leaving those outer edge sites, we can use them for reforestation, we can use them for stormwater park, we can use them for stormwater feature, we can use them for recreation paths and access points. In some cases, we would also like to reduce surface parking. Per my earlier discussion, we don't think we're going to be too radical with that, but that also allows us to green the campus. So then the last piece of big idea thinking here is really about reinvestment in the core of campus. And I just gave you some examples of that as we see the end of useful life of buildings on the edge. But it's really important for us, given that we expect to see a population on campus of between 9,000 to 10,000 students for even the long horizon of this plan, that we need to use the buildings we have. We need to do the energy efficiency retrofits. We need to, in some cases, undergo radical renovation, reconstruction of those buildings to make them fit for the programmatic requirements we have today. There will be demolitions involved, and there are 1 or 2 properties we're targeting for divestment. The campus core is another important target for us in terms of open space. We believe the oldest housing on campus, Burnside and Vermilion, are perfect targets for demolition. They are not housing units that suit our population needs. Regent Kenyanya is nodding. He may have knowledge of this. But that is, again, another location that offers us recreation, an enhancement to student life, and the ability to take down buildings that are really much more of a burden than they should be on the campus footprint economically and operationally. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Shane to talk about this important piece of our work.
Thank you. So to build on what Monique has already teased some with you in terms of like how we're thinking about transitioning the energy system and how do we make the campus more resilient to the impacts of climate change, I'm going to give you an explanation about more of the what and the why we're doing this and what we're proposing here. So there's a lot going on in this slide, and I'm going to try to break it down into a couple different parts. First, you'll recall that the majority of the emissions that contribute to climate change that come from campus are ones that get generated because of the heating, the cooling, and the electricity use that we have on campus, these Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And to eliminate these emissions, we need to create heat and cooling using electricity rather than burning a fuel. And we need to ensure that that electricity comes from renewable sources. This is one of the best and most reliable established pathways for how we can do this as a society, and certainly within the UMD campus. Regarding heat, today we burn fossil fuels like natural gas in a central district energy facility, and then we distribute that as steam to the buildings to be distributed there and use that steam for heating those facilities. In the future, we're going to do something different. We're going to capture the heat below our feet. And we're going to use other sources of heat, waste heat that come from buildings and other opportunities. And through heat exchangers, heat recovery, and heat pumps powered by electricity, move that heat to our buildings via hot water rather than steam. You'll notice that the conversion of the energy system, as shown on other graphs and slides already, takes place largely below ground. And that means it has a significant interaction with the physical environment and planning on campus. So timing of these improvements with other things happening, whether that be rec field enhancements or building demolition or renovation, is really critical. Regarding electricity, recent state law puts utilities like Minnesota Power on a path to get to 100% clean energy by 2040. And we're going to benefit from that transition, but we can also accelerate it by increasing the resilience and investing in on-campus solar and different facilities on campus, which are shown in the purple. And then finally, around buildings and the energy that it takes to heat, cool, and power them, we just have to become much more energy efficient with how we use energy. We are already there. As the Chancellor noted, there has been a significant reduction in the energy use intensity per square foot over time. But we need to expand on that prior work and really build out to make this an affordable strategy, but also to reduce that demand that we're putting on the resources, the energy resources, whether they be grid resources or our own resources on campus. And then finally, not to be ignored, transportation continues to be a component of our emissions footprint as an institution, and that's true for the Duluth campus as well. And so how people get to and from around campus interplays with that physical environment. So Monique has already talked about how we want to take steps that improve the access to sustainable modes of transit, whether that be walking or biking or public transit services for people that can use them that are in close proximity to the campus. And then we also recognize that we will continue to have students and employees who are coming from a great distance away, and that in order for them to be able to transition to things like electric cars, which don't produce emissions through their operation, we need to be able to provide electric vehicle charging infrastructure so people can avail themselves of that opportunity as things progress. Next slide. On the resilience side, I already pointed out and talked about how Duluth as a region and an area is fortunate in the fact that from a climate change perspective is anticipated to see fewer impacts compared to other parts of the state. but that doesn't mean it's spared from those impacts. And we certainly know and have already seen some climate change impacts materialize in the city of Duluth, for those of you who recall the flooding of the early 2010s, 2012. So it's really important that we continue to acknowledge that there will be climate change impacts, even if Duluth is in a better position than most. And a lot of that has to do with things that we are going to have to undertake in terms of infrastructure and incorporating those climate change impacts and projections into how we do campus design. We've already discussed and highlighted some opportunities around that in terms of changing our energy system and transitioning it to different forms of energy, but then also making that infrastructure more resilient to impacts and able to bounce back when those things happen. Resiliency doesn't mean that we're going to be immune to a shock, but it means that we have the ability to respond quickly and bounce back from those and recover with speed. It's not just infrastructure, though. We also need to think about the natural environment and how do we enhance the natural environment to manage stormwater, to reduce not only our own impacts on campus, but as Monique pointed out, those downstream, down the hill, benefit greatly in terms of the reduced water flow that might be flowing downhill toward Lake Superior. And then finally, all of these strategies, along with a lot of the things that we talked about in terms of improving the campus experience for students, also help build strength within the community and resiliency at a personal and a social level that's really critical. I will pass it back to the Chancellor to close us out.
Very good. Thank you, Shane. So I said I would finish with the word aspirational, and I think that's an important one, but I want to connect it back to strategies and the reality of today. This gives us a pathway to a fully sustainable future. And that's really a big marker. And if you don't start somewhere, you'll never get there. And it also sees us reinvesting in some core assets. Monique talked about the ancient healthcare center, when we serve 10,000, close to 10,000 students from, more residence halls. Those kinds of things are vital to the long-term future of UMD, but they're also critically interwoven with us stabilizing and hopefully growing that undergraduate enrollment and perhaps a little bit on that graduate side. So we recognize that, and I don't throw it out as a wait and see kind of thing. We're going to do that, but as that progresses and as we lock in what we think that that long-term student population looks like in as I've told you before, an overcrowded, oversupplied, and market with falling demand, we got to figure that out. I think that becomes the launch point then for some of these investments. I noticed Regent Kenyanya smiling about references to Vermilion and Burnside. One of the upper class housing places I lived is long gone, thankfully, demolished long since. So there's a few others on campus there, Greg's and others, that there's a lot of reinvestment going on. But the student life component of this drives a great deal of it. And then as someone who spent most of their private sector life in the energy field, it's exciting and really inspirational in many ways, alongside of the aspirational nature of this, to think about what could we do differently to power or to heat and cool this campus. Our partners at our electric utility are great, but we're still burning a lot of natural gas, and we have assets there that actually consume the gas and turn it into steam that are getting old. So these decisions are coming at us whether we want to be aspirational about the future or not. So thanks for your time today. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about my favorite campus, and we look forward to coming back in September. But I think we have an opportunity for some questions.
Tad Johnson. Thank you for the great presentation. I think this is really important work that we're doing, and I think on all of our campuses, we need to get there. I think it does become, I think people look to our campus and they get inspired by the things we do to further help themselves. I know at Morris, they've been a magnet for all kinds of people in the other communities to put into projects, whether it's methane digesters or recycling or whatever it is, solar, you name it. So I really applaud you on this. It's a very big project, and I'd like to see the cost of it. But right now, we have a few minutes for questions, and we'll start with Tad Johnson. Regent Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the presentation. And it's very nice to look at maps where I can find my house. So I'm 3 minutes away from UMD. So anyway, I just wanted to comment on a few different things. One is how important UMD is to the Duluth economy and just the whole region, how important it is. The research that's done there at NRRI, important to the Iron Range. Anyway, but the chancellor may remember when I would drive to law school in the 70s, all these things moved out of Duluth. The air base, some of the Palucci enterprises, and the steel mill, steel plant, and the population went from over 100,000 down to about 86, where it is now. And there was a sign that said on the way out, the last person out of Duluth, please turn out the lights. So we all thought, this city is dying. But now the hospitals are expanding exponentially. And really the two great places to work in the city, among many, are the University of Minnesota Duluth and in the medical fields there. So anyway, I think the community appreciates UMD, and when the students come back, and they'll come back in August, it makes the city come alive again. But in reference to some of the comments, I've now heard like 3 different stories, one on public radio, one on WDIO television, about there's a group of folks called climate migrants that are targeting Duluth as a potential city of the future, and I hope that's the case. I was talking with another region earlier about, it was 90 down here. As soon as you get to Moose Lake, it starts to drop a little. And when you get into the Lake Superior Basin, it gets down to about 60, 59, something like that. And that's how we spend a lot of our summer days up there, which is not that bad. But anyway, a lot of the students I would talk with, as I used to advise freshmen, and they would have come to UMD because of the all the opportunities for outdoor sports, whether it's cross-country skiing, downhill skiing, mountain biking, just the region itself and the lake. There's people out there surfing when the wind is up in wetsuits, thank God. So anyway, but I was just wondering, I love the idea of connecting Bagley with Chester Park, and I'm just wondering how, I know this is aspirational, but how possible is that? And additional green spaces are always a good idea for that campus.
Chair Hipsch, Regent Johnson, we believe that the first connection, top of the hill between Hartley to the north and Bagley and to Chester Park is actually very viable for reasons of existing Superior Hiking Trail is right adjacent to Bagley. And so working through with city and region to make that connection to Hartley work, I think is not going to be as challenging as it would if there were no Superior Hiking Trail ethos there, the through hike, it's there, so we can build on it. I think to the Chester Park direction, there is a city bike trail currently partially existing and then expanded, planned. And so I think you can see it, there's an orange line that goes through that green arrow and it sort of jogs around, reflecting that trail alignment. So from a very simple concrete and like signage, where's the trail, I don't think that's the difficult part. I think getting people to understand, more like the diagram we showed you when we started, what does it bring you if you get on this trail? What will you find? What will you discover? And there are lots of people who are really good at that, in Duluth proper. And I think that introduction to campus for new students and staff will be a tremendous asset. So I'm hopeful that there's ways we can make it very accessible to people in their minds and then physically as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Regent Farnsworth, we're running a little behind here, so we got several people on the list, so go ahead.
Great, thanks, Chair Hips. This is going to be really quick because I think I'm an interloper in the Duluth section of the table here. So they're going to say a lot more. They're going to say a lot more well-informed things than I am, but I just wanted to highlight, besides thank you for the presentation, I was intrigued by the whole idea of having a coordinated campus plan with a climate action plan, and heard you talk a little, extensively about that and why that's important and innovative. And I just, wanted to express appreciation for that, particularly having this conversation in this setting, because these are two very important pieces, and really enjoyed taking a deep dive on a system campus in particular with a different planning lens than I've experienced here before. So that's all I'll say. I said I'd keep it quick, and I will. Thanks.
Thank you, Regent. Regent Kenyanya.
Can't make the same promise, so I'll jump right in. This is a great plan, and I think the term aspirational was used, which is what you want to do. Throw everything there, and then we'll see what we'll be able to get to. The current plan has a mall coming out of Solon Campus Center, and I've been waiting for that. So hopefully we get to more things on this one. A couple comments and questions as well. Chancellor McMillan, you kind of touched on this. You talked about enrollment, and it's hard not to talk about that when you're looking at this. UMD's had a wide range of enrollment, over the past couple of decades, but some people will say it hasn't dropped as much as we look at it because it was too high at some point, right? I mean, were the classrooms available at that time? I think we had students at hotels, at one point. Yeah, so I would just wonder, I imagine when you make this plan, you do have to land at a number, an assumption, that you're looking to support in a plan. So I'd be curious what that is. And then another comment, on one of these pages, there's a marker, explore future housing acquisition. And when I first saw that, I'm like, that's crazy. That's in a neighborhood. But I will say, I've seen Assistant Vice President Krieger do much more complex things, so I wouldn't put it past you. And I think that's just a good consideration, because the campus is so, I don't want to use landlocked, because it's obviously all land, but it's like double landlocked, in terms of, where do you go? So, to the extent that opportunities like that are possible, I think they're good things to be thinking of. And then on sustainability, I think the university does have a responsibility, if you will, to kind of nudge people towards where we should all be as society. If you surveyed people right now and asked for the top needs, I don't think they'd tell you to get rid of parking per se, but that we in student government, that was one of the top issues we heard. Food, it was dining and parking, and then we found archives of the Statesman from about the time you were there, Chancellor McMillan, and it was food and parking. So I don't know what that says, but I think I guess my comment is, I agree that we should nudge people, but then how do we do that? How do we time that with some of the other things, right? How do we time that with working with the Duluth Transit Authority to see what's happening there? We know one of the city's biggest priorities is increasing housing, and particularly affordable housing. How do we have that play in as a factor into that? And we're planning for more housing on campus. So just making sure that this aspirational goal we have is still being done in the most painless way, if you will, and especially with one other thing I thought of with Kirby Drive, I'm really one of the two thoroughfares through campus is to just consider accessibility, because if I think I read here, one proposal was to limit that from private vehicles, which would be great, but then just considering how people, as you said, that's the heart of campus, right? So for people who need that mobility accommodations, what we can do about that, so, thanks.
Any comments?
Sure. Thanks, Chair Hipsch and Regent Kenyanya. Your knowledge of the campus is marvelous. I'm only going to comment on enrollment because it is so central. The rest of those topics we're noting and built in. But two high water marks, if you go back 2012, 2011, 2012, I think the total campus population was just under 12,000. That's the all-time kind of high water mark. And then the more relevant one is probably 2017, 2018, when it was 11.2. So closer to 11,000. We're not going to see those numbers again. And at the risk of being oversimplified here, I mean, I use 10,000. I've used that with you before. I don't know if that's the right number. The more important number in that is not how many are there for med and pharmacy and non-degree seeking. It's that undergraduate number. And we've got to stabilize at least 7,800 and hopefully grow that a little bit. So I think that's the range we plan around. And some of the investments are no-brainers. We have to invest in the core kitchen. What Vice Chancellor Irwin does and her team with what they've got, 70-0 production kitchen, is crazy, but we got to do that. But the rest of them, I think, pivot, healthcare, more money into our signature rec sports and outdoor program. Those are going to pivot, and then housing itself off of us demonstrating to you and this system that we can stabilize that enrollment, perhaps grow it a little, but I harbor no illusions about going back to those big numbers, and the investment that would take is probably unrealistic. So I'll be very happy if we can find a number in that five-digit range at 10,000. So,
thank you, Regent Verhalen.
Thanks, Chair Hipsch. I will keep it very short. I just wanted to revisit an exchange that Senior Vice President Franz and I had last time Chief Sustainability Officer Stennis was here, which is, we know this kind of work will cost a lot of capital. We know it will cost a lot of money. But understanding that we would be making a transition in significant areas from O&M to running our own systems to capital offsetting that O&M. And so as you come before us again, that step and that piece and understanding in what are we spending now on O&M for energy production, maintenance of the facilities, maintenance of the green spaces that are currently there, manicured lawns, et cetera, versus paying this capital and offsetting that in what way, shape, or form, I think is really important for the overall understanding of what sustainability really means. Thanks.
Very excellent point. Okay, Regent Gully.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, I moved over here.
You're over there now. Okay, you switched. No, just kidding.
I just want to say this plan is phenomenal, and it's really clear that you've put a ton of thought, and I'm sure many, many, many months and years into considering these changes. A couple of things. So actually, this is, I think, a good follow-up to Regent Verhalen. I was thinking about things like so I love decreasing parking lot space, and it's something that I think about a lot. But are there ways that we can think about, speaking of like the things that we invest in upfront that have a huge impact on our energy efficiency and also overall costs, in the long run, are there things that you could think of that we could invest in that might make it easier for people to get to campus without using cars? I know, here on the Twin Cities campus, this is also a big issue. It's something that I've experienced firsthand as a student and as someone who works here. And so I know how tricky it can be when you have to get from like one place to another to not have a car. But, what if we just spitballing, offset the cost of students purchasing e-assist bikes or something like that? Are there targeted ways that we could reduce the need for cars on campus? And then my second question is, and this may be in the plan, I just couldn't find it, and maybe I missed it when you said it, but are there plans to move away from high maintenance turf to more low maintenance like cover crops and native grasses and things like that?
Regent Gully, and I'll start, and then do you have something right now?
Maybe.
Okay. I would say that I'm sure there are ways we can think about as we're actually implementing this and the trip to campus by something other than a car, such as, an offset, like a universal transit pass kind of equivalent or an e-bike. And I think that's exactly the work that we do once we've set these aspirational plans that describe our vision and our desired outcomes. So absolutely, cities are doing good work like that. We operate like a small city at each campus site relative to the scale of the city we live in. So those are things that will be to come. We didn't talk about it in the package you received, so you did not miss it. I think we are really struggling with winter conditions at Duluth campus. So I honestly think things like electric vehicles, which are still vehicles but have much less footprint, are our best option. And if you recall that pie chart in terms of the population traveling by car, where they live, we're not going to find a great way to offset except by vehicle. And as the auto industry evolves, I'm more hopeful than I was even 10 years ago. I think that's what I had. If you have something.
I think I have anything to add.
Thank you. And finally, Student Representative Tuft. Or did you have a follow-up?
Oh,
Okay,
yeah,
sorry.
I was just wondering about the high-maintenance turf areas and stuff.
Regent Kelly, I'm sorry. I knew you asked me something else.
Yeah.
Again, we did not specify that in this particular set of documents, but those are, we have goals and direction strategy, and then we have specific actions we will take. And the extent to which we can convert lawn, to more drought tolerant, that's exactly the resilience comment Shane was mentioning. So that will be part of implementing this. So the rec field area you see on that southeast corner, how can we make sure that that's either capturing water, requires less maintenance, is it artificial? That's a lot higher first cost, but it goes along with the comment of if you have a higher first cost and you offset other costs, you'll get there. So these are, I would say you won't see all of those things detailed when you get the plan book in the fall, because we live at this level for a campus plan, and it allows staff who are very resourceful, creative, focused on implementation to say, look, this aligns and meets the goal, let me get it done.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Student Representative Tuft.
Thank you, Chair Hips and presenters. This is a great plan. I've had the chance to see it before, just through I'm a Duluth student, but I want to echo some things Regent Kenyanya had to say about parking. We do still talk about parking, and that it's a huge issue that students are really passionate about. And as you mentioned, the winter weather conditions make other modes of getting to campus really difficult. So I would, as a former, I guess I'm a former Duluth student now, but I would really encourage the parking to keep as much parking as we're able to, and hopefully the EVs will begin to evolve and students will be able to get them. Also, one thing I had in mind was maintaining accessibility through that sustainability corridor. I know things get reworked. I'm thinking that's daycare drop off right there. That's offices where a ton of admin is, the student life office is right, just that people come in and out of. So just maintaining, accessibility through there would be really important. And then I'll wrap up here. I've been really impressed with the amount of student input that you all have gathered thus far. I really want to encourage you to maintain that, especially when we're getting into, lower level projects. I think that the student input it's really vital, and I know Chancellor is really, he really loves to talk with the students and get our input, but just that's maintained, and I think that the students really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Regent, we're going to have to move along, but we're bringing this back in the fall, and you can answer your questions at the break. So, okay, moving to the fourth item on the agenda. Our fourth item is to act on the proposed off-cycle amendments to Board of Regents policy on the endowment fund. Here to respond to any final questions or comments is Deputy Chief Investment Officer Andrew Parks. There have been no changes made to the proposed amendments since the committee reviewed them in May. Given that, and before we turn to any final questions or discussion, is there a motion to recommend adoption of the proposed amendments to the Board of Regents Policy Endowment Fund? Okay, is there a second? Second. Okay, there's a motion and a second. Is there any discussion on the motion?
Can I just ask, sort of a point of privilege, would you just quickly go over the amendments? The May meeting was my first meeting, so I would appreciate just a little bit of a refresher.
Sure. Thank you, Chair Hipsch and Regent Gully. So I would say at a very high level, you can bifurcate the amendments into two different topics. One relates to the asset allocation framework for the endowment, and then the other relates to the principles around environmental, social, and governance-related practices and how those are embedded in our processes. And so I'd say the takeaway to the former issue is that the changes that we're proposing are very incremental as opposed to transformational. So you'll see that we're proposing taking a small amount of capital, about 3% in our safer fixed income investments and moving it into equities, and then making a small shift of roughly 5% from more liquid investments into less liquid ones where we've had some success. On the environmental, social, and governance related issues, I think the substantive change in the policy is that there's a shift from the languaging that says that we will consider ESG to integrate. And there was a lot of time spent talking about kind of that nomenclature and the rationale behind that verbiage. But I think the key takeaway of it is that we presented, we've consulted pretty heavily with a lot of folks across the institution. We've talked about this spectrum across which you can think about ESG, and that for the sake of alliteration, we said you can be antagonistic, you can be kind of apathetic or agnostic, you can be aware, you can be actively mandated, or you can be aggressively all in. And so we've presented this concept of really being in the middle and being ESG aware. And I think that concept of making money while doing good resonated with the constituencies that we spoke with. And I think it's a better reflection, or one of the reasons why we landed on this word of integrate, because a lot of this is already are practices that are already in place that we utilize. But we wanted to, I think, codify and just call out that in our mind, ESG is not an output, it's an input. It's part of our process. It's also not just a fossil fuel issue. It's something that's really embedded in how we look at how we support, for example, emerging and minority-owned managers, or how we invest our capital in new technologies that are helping to modernize the grid or other areas. And so the other piece to it that is worth noting is that there's an underscoring of the importance of transparency, given that's a key principle of the institution. We've been investing time and resources in trying to be able to come up with metrics and methods to better quantify. If you believe in the adage that you can't manage what you can't measure, we want to be able to better quantify and be transparent about the exposures that we have as it relates to this topic of ESG. So I'd say that, and I can get into any more detail, obviously, that would be of interest to you or other members of the board, but I think at a high level, that's the substance of it.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Is that good? Any further discussion? Okay, so there being no further discussion, you appear ready to vote. So all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Okay, all opposed, say no. Okay, the motion is approved. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, that brings us to the consent report. Senior Vice President Franz needed to step away to attend a meeting with state leaders, so Associate Vice President Mike Vona will join us for the last two items. Associate Vice President Vona, will you summarize the items in today's consent report?
Thank you, Chair Hipsch, members of the committee. Your consent agenda begins on page 219. There are a number of things I'll just briefly touch on. First, purchases of goods and services. You have two this month. One related to the Twin Cities athletic venues actually was issued as one RFP, but there are a number of vendors that were selected as part of that process. The other is a purchase for various supplies and services related to UMD dining. You'll note in your materials that one is actually being awarded by virtue of another public entity that did a public RFP process, and we're allowed to do that. Second item in your docket then is the allocation of proceeds from the long-term capital financing program. In 2022, the university issued $500 million of debt. We intended to achieve a number of outcomes in that, but one of them was that we wanted to pre-finance our 5 and 6 year capital plan at the rates that were available at that time. The money has been invested and is waiting for use. Board policy requires you to approve us withdrawing that money and using it for capital projects. So the projects that are listed under this in the docket represent projects that you as a board and your predecessors previously approved and have been ongoing and are now ready to be locked in with these long-term funds. Third item in the docket consent is the appointment of Board of Trustees members to the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum Foundation. After that, there's one employment agreement related to the new dean for the College of Design on the Twin Cities campus. And finally, the last item in the consent represents a resolution to refinance debt. University typically issues our debt with a provision that allows us to refinance it at about a 10-year period if market conditions are favorable. If you look at your materials, you see that we have 4 that are eligible, 4 series of debts that are available. 2 of them right now represent possible savings. The resolution would authorize us to refinance them at any time in the next year, depending on market conditions, and only if they yield a savings of at least 3%. This is a very typical thing we've done in the past, and we would seek approval on that as well.
Thank you. So before I invite a motion to recommend approval of the consent report, you are welcome to ask questions, make comments, or ask for an item to be separated out from the report to be voted on separately. Are there any questions, comments, or requests to separate an item out? Regent Farnsworth.
Very quickly, Chair Hipsch, thank you. I wasn't sure where to ask this, and maybe it's tomorrow, or maybe I'm just missing it in here, but I thought it was relevant to our long-term capital financing program. We had gotten a few emails, and I had read somewhere about a capital investment for women's gymnastics facility. Am I completely making that up, or was that on here, or part of this, or never part of this? Or that can be a follow-up too, just for our staff. So that can be addressed later, but I thought it was a part of this. So thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Regent Hipsch, Regent Farnsworth, I believe that is noted in the 2024 capital request or capital budget materials.
Got it. Thanks.
Thank you. Regent Kenyanya.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a clarification on process and with respect to the long-term capital financing program. So these items coming in the consent agenda is just a function of where that financing has come from, but the projects themselves were discussed, previously as a capital budget amendment or something else. This is just because of where that source is coming. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair Hipsch, Regent Kenyanya, that is correct. All of the projects listed have been previously approved in accordance with board policy, and now we are simply coming to you for approval to use those funds to lock in the long-term financing on them.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay, is there a motion to recommend approval of the consent report?
So moved.
Second. Okay, there's been a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Say no. No, okay, the motion is passed, so thank you. Thank you, Vice President Volna, for that. So, okay, we are, I gotta look at my agenda here. That brings us to informational items, I guess. Vice President Volna, anything to highlight?
Chair Hipsch, and members of the committee, there are 3 information items, general contingency allocations. There are none this year, so it's this month, so it's in the information item. Investment Advisory Committee, the minutes from the last meeting, and then finally, you'll note that we have included the preliminary 2024 state capital request. The preliminary request is due to the state on June 16th. The final one will be due on October 15th. So to meet the very early deadline, we submit a preliminary one, but be assured that we will be coming back and talking to you before we submit the final one to make sure that the priorities and what the request is consistent with what your wishes are.
Thank you. Any other thing for the good of the order? If not, there being no additional business before this committee, we stand adjourned. And thank you, everyone.